This is a concept that we are dealing in the past several days when we have a dual penalty such as death penalty and monetary payment reflect upon individual who violated two entities such as something that he deserved, capital punishment, and also it's a compensation, it's a monetary damage. We impose upon the person the severe punishment and we exempted him or her from the monetary payment, for example. So, here is a scenario. If someone did something that's a violation of, for example, Shabbat, or something related to idolatry, so even it's involved with also something that created a damage, meaning monetary payment, the monetary payment will not impose since you have the heavy payment over there. Another subject we're going to discuss is the idea of damage when it's already a sub-consequence of a court decision. Meaning, for example, an ox. The ox went and killed someone. The ox of Mr. A, let's call him Reuven, killed Mr. Shimon. That owner, meaning Reuven, was called upon the court, and the court said, you have to put this animal to sleep. Period. That animal killed a person. Meanwhile, while the animal is already under the verdict of the court, someone stole that animal, or the owner of the animal went ahead and slaughtered that animal in order to, for example, sell it, eat it, etc. The question is that animal carry a monetary value, which means, is that animal, since it's already in a sense designated for death, it doesn't carry any value. It can be an ox that's worth $100,000 and now it's worth zero. So how exactly you treated post-verdict, post-court verdict to those animals? Another question is a question of borrower and owner. For example, you borrow an animal in those days, but it can have an application to our days. You borrow an animal to walk in your field. For example, you need an ox to do some plowing in your field. And while borrowing, there is a certain treatment you need to give. For example, you need to feed the animal during the time of labor. You need to give the animal a break, etc. The borrower, in order, for example, to save money, he put a something like a muscle or something on the animals, so the animal basically will walk but not get fed. So in a way, it's like you're borrowing a car, for example, and you don't treat the car the way that the owner expects you to treat it. You're renting a car from a rental company, and you do all kind of things. They ask you, for example, to change oil. They ask you, for example, to be careful in certain curves, etc. You do not treat it the way you're supposed to treat it. How exactly the halacha, how exactly the Jewish law follow with those borrowers? So we are on page 33, 2 lines from the bottom of the page. אי בתובח על ידי אחר, מהי טעמיו דרבנן דפטרי? Yesterday, at the very end of our shiur, we talk about the difference, the disputation between the majority of the sages and the other views. So when it's come to a extra payment, we call it arba'a vechamisha, which is in some cases we impose upon the person to pay an extra, which is called 4 and 5. 4 and 5, as we said yesterday, it's extra payment. And now the question is, if you have kimle b'derabba minei, which means if you have a violation of Shabbat, and you also have a monetary payment involved with it. So the sages come in and said, take for example a case when someone who is slaughtered by means of others, meaning you take a fellow and you send him to do some stealing, and or the thief asks someone else to slaughter for him. So the question is how you treat it. For example, a thief went on Shabbat. He stole an animal, and then he himself took that animal and slaughtered it on Shabbat. So the question is, why here we said that we treat it differently, and we said that as much as you have the kimle b'derabba, which means you impose upon, when it's a 2 penalty, the heavy penalty, since you have someone else to do it for you, so you're already exempt from the heavy penalty. If you're exempt from the heavy penalty, we should impose upon you the 4 and 5. So the question is, how and why the sages treated differently in a case that someone else is emissary for you? Man chachamim. Who are the majority of the sages who hold it? 34, Rabbi Shimon hi. Meaning, when we use the term sages for our discussion, is the view of Rabbi Shimon. De Amar. This is a text in the Tractate Chulin, page 85. Shchita she'eina re'uya, lo shema shchita. In the Tractate Chulin 85, there is a very deep, long discussion over manner of slaughtering. Meaning, as we all know, the slaughtering has to be a certain ritual process. Now, the final stage is when it's all said and done, that animal is befitting for consumption, that past animal. If anything happened during that process, the animal is treif, is not kosher, and you cannot eat it. Now, the problem is if someone does that on the holiday of Shabbat, for example. So in one hand, he can do the shchita, the process of slaughtering, according to halacha. Yet, the day that it was performed is the day that he is in a severe violation of Torah law. So, how you treat it? Another scenario. Someone purchased an animal, and that animal went to a process of slaughter, and all of a sudden it turns that that animal it's not befitting for consumption, such as you find a hole in the intestine, such as the process of the knives wasn't made properly, such as the whole ritual didn't follow the code. So that animal is keres, which means you cannot use it anymore. Yet the Torah tells us in the book of Vayikra, in Leviticus 22, Oto ve'ed bno, the animal and its baby, for example, the father ox and the son ox, you cannot slaughter in one day. So now the question is, since the quote-unquote father or mother is no longer befitting for consumption because during the process of the slaughtering something happened and therefore the animal is not befitting for consumption, do we allow to go ahead that the same day and take the baby, the son, and slaughter it? So here we said that you do allow, because the prohibition to slaughter father and son is only in a case that you are ready for consumption. Now, if on Shabbat you say that the shchita, the process of slaughtering, was okay, yet it happened on Shabbat, so you do not have a reason to impose upon that individual the payment of 4 and 5, because it's not considering toveach, it's not considering a manner of slaughtering. So by Rabbi Shimon is exempt, meaning when it's not proper shchita, is no longer in violation of toveach. So for example, if someone took chayayin off, he took like fall or bird, right? So part of the mitzvah, it's called kisui hadam, to cover the blood, meaning the Torah required a person who involved with the process of slaughtering, right, to cover the blood. What happened if during the process it turns that that animal is no longer befitting for consumption? Is the fellow that required to cover the blood is still under the same requirement as a regular consumption? Basically, the way we see it here is no longer under that requirement. So there is a Tosfot in Tractate Bava Kama, page 71a, that have a big derivative discussion from our point here, which is if a person can prohibit something that it's not his by having some actions. So the Gemara challenged that. They said, Ha teinach avodat kochavim v'shor haniskal. Here you use 3 examples, 2 of which go to one direction and 1 go to the other direction. Example number 1. Someone stole an animal, and the purpose of him stealing that animal, he was dying to worship idol, and therefore he stole animal in order to serve the idol. The book of Psalms, chapter 106, one of the claim that the psalmist King David said is Vayitzamdu leval peor vayochlu zivchei meitim, which means the form of which one worship idol, it's called a slaughtering animal for dead people, which means the same way as any form of careless animal we are prohibited to derive any benefit, the same way when it's come to idol worship, in any derivative form, even for example is no longer used for idol worshiping, it's still, by the way the sages put it in the Tractate Avodah Zarah, page 29b, it's still prohibited. So if someone took an animal that the thief used for idol worship, and he now took that animal, is nothing you can do with that. Even is no longer exercise that idol worshipping. Or the same apply to ox that designated for death, such as ox, as we said, committed a crime by killing someone, and the verdict was in order from the court, it already took place, that this ox designated to death because he killed a person. Therefore, any derivative from that ox's body is prohibited. The Torah said in the book of Shmot, book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 28, if an ox went ahead and used his horn and killed man or woman, that ox need to be stoned. But the Torah go further, and we all know that the Torah is very prudent in words. The Torah said, "Velo ya'achel," you cannot use that meat by any mean. But the moment you put the animal to sleep, or whatever you do, in the biblical term, you stone the animal, the owner of that animal is free from any further monetary payment. So this is something we studied on Tractate Psachim, page 22, and also in the Tractate Bava Kama 41. The Gemara said, since the Torah used the term that ox shall be stoned, so how do you know the prohibition against deriving any benefit? So the Gemara go further to say it's over. What does that mean, it's over? The moment the court put a verdict that that ox deserves stoning, so you are no longer have anything to do with that. So if the owner went ahead and he took that ox that already designated for stoning and he slaughtered that ox, it's not considering, even he did it in a kosher way, it's not considering befitting for consumption by any means. Furthermore, that ox is such a, in a sense, ownerless, that even derivative, you can think about giving it to your animals to eat, or giving it to a non-Jew, or whatever it is.
The hide for leather or something
yes,
like that.
Yes, you cannot use any form. It's over. So therefore, this is two examples that we understand the statement. However, Ela shchita b'Shabbat, shchita reuyahi. Even someone violating Shabbat, by the, again, the concept of the dry understanding of the law, still the manner of which the slaughtering took place, if everything happened there in the kosher way, you may think at this stage that that animal can be eaten even it was a violation of Shabbat. Here is the text. Ditnan. Listen carefully. This is Mishnah, Tractate Chulin, page 14a. Hashochet b'Shabbat uviyom haKippurim. The Torah used the term, that soul shall be cut off. It applies to both, slaughtering on Shabbat and or if it's the Day of Atonement. Now, this is one phase of the law. Yet the Gemara said, Af al pi shemitchayev benafsho, shchitato kshera, even he is under violation, that soul shall be cut off. Still, if the process of slaughtering was proper, that meat can be used for consumption. Now, why? Because in a general term, you have here, in a sense, two separate set of law. Now, if we juxtapose that point to our main discussion over payment of 4 and 5, you see here, number one, the proof from the Mishnah that Maaseh Shabbat mutar, number one. Number two, you have here proof from this Mishnah that this ena shchita nifselet, that this manner of slaughtering does not carry any future prohibition against eating that meat. And you have here a huge disputation among the early sages if in a final practical halacha stage, if that meat is befitting for consumption or not. But here you see something, a new avenue that have a lot of halachic, practical halachical applications. How? Listen. Savar la ki Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar. I have the privilege to visit his site close to Tzfat, North Israel. Anyway, here you see a great rabbi that also a how do you say, shoemaker?
Shoemaker, yep.
Shoemaker. Anyway, he hold that if someone intentionally slaughter an animal on Shabbat, that meat is prohibited forever. Now, just point of departure before we read the text. There is a Rashi and Tosfot that have a disputation over reading those views. So let's first read it. The Tanya, המבשל בשבת בשוגג לא יאכל במזיד, בשוגג יאכל, במזיד לא יאכל. Okay, here is the idea. Rashi tells us, if it was someone, he forget that today is Shabbat, or he forget that we are, or he is not aware that you are not supposed to cook on Shabbat. So, according to the way Rashi sees it, so he said that that applies solely for unwittingly, for shogeg. And therefore, Rabbi Meir holds that only the fine, the knas, applies when a person does it b'mezid, with full intent. Now, Rashi in Tractate Chulin, page 15, derive a little different avenue, but that's general. The general term is b'mezid, if it was intentional. You cannot eat that meat forever, le'olamim. B'shogeg, you can eat it even on Shabbat itself. That's one avenue. Now, דברי רבי מאיר, רבי יהודה אומר, בשוגג יאכל למוצאי שבת, במזיד לא יאכל עולמית. Now, here Tosfot said that even במזיד is a disputation between them, which means the Rashi and Tosfot have different avenue how to read this braita. But the idea by Rabbi Yehuda said, if it was unwittingly, if the person not intent to do that, he forget that today is Shabbat, right? Or he doesn't aware of that. Right. So therefore, when bichdei sheyaseh, when Shabbat is over, you wait a certain period of time that takes a person to cook or bake that type of meat, and from that point and onward, the person can eat it because the original intent on Shabbat, meaning wasn't in intent of violation, versus if it was intentional, then forever lasting is prohibited. Now, you see here, the Rosh Yosef explained to us in that statement, Tractate Chulin, page 15. The idea is that we have a period of time, it's called Bichdei Sheyasu. Bichdei Sheyasu is a period of time between Havdalah till that very moment that the food is ready, and if you pass that time, as long as it's not intentional, a person can eat it. Rabbi Yochanan Sandlar Omer, listen carefully what he said. Beshogeg yochal lemotzei Shabbat. If it was unintentional, as we said, wait bichdei sheyasu, wait the period of time it takes you to cook it, and then onward you can eat. Let me elaborate for a second, just to make sure that we all understand. Let's say it took a person to put together the pieces and cook it hour and a half, right? So if Shabbat is over at 6:30, the moment you perform the Havdalah at 6:31, and then hour and a half later, which is what? 8 o'clock, you can eat it. Okay? La'acherim velo lo. If he cooked it for others, that's the rule. Versus, if he does it for himself, even it was unintentional, is prohibited forever. So Rabbi Yochanan Sandlar hold that the sages prohibited to derive any benefit even from a food that the person cooked unintentionally on Shabbat. So therefore, according to that view, on Shabbat itself is prohibited to eat even for others. But bichdei sheyasu, when Shabbat is over, Motzei Shabbat, for other people, they can eat it. For himself, never. Okay? So here you see, במזיד, if it was intentional, לא יאכל עולמית, לא לו ולא לאחרים. So how do you put it together? What we understand so far. If someone cooked on Shabbat, Here we see a two huge avenue between someone who does it for himself or someone who does it for others. According to a first view, Rabbi Meir, what did Rabbi Meir tell us? If it was unintentional, if you do it for yourself, you can eat it immediately. If you do it for others, you can use it immediately, as long as it's not intentional. If it was intentional, Rabbi Meir said, if it's for yourself, is prohibited forever. In parentheses, Rashi in Chulin 15 said that after Shabbat it is okay to eat it. For others, you can eat it, they can eat it immediately. That's Rabbi Meir's view. Rabbi Yehuda views, again, he differentiated between unwittingly, unintentional, and intentional. He said, if a person does it unintentional for himself, so after Shabbat is over, you wait a period of time and you can eat it. Versus if you do it for others, unintentional, they can eat it immediately by Rabbi Yehuda's view. Versus if it was intentional, so if it's for yourself, it's prohibited forever. However, if you did it for others intentionally, listen carefully, when Shabbat is over, they can eat it. Versus the third view of whom? Rabbi Yochanan Sandlar. Rabbi Yochanan Sandlar tells us if it was unintentional and a person does that for himself, is prohibited forever. So how much so, Kal Vachomer, that if it was intentional, you do it for yourself, so Rabbi Yochanan Sandlar said for sure it's prohibited forever. However, Rabbi Yochanan Sandlar came and said, if you did it for someone else, if it was unintentional, then you wait after Shabbat is over, bichdei sheyasu, and then others can eat it. But if you did something intentional, even for others, Rabbi Yochanan Sandlar said, I disputed Rabbi Yehuda, and I hold that that food is prohibited forever, even after Shabbat, even for others. So what you see here, Rabbi Yochanan Sandlar hold that anything that was made intentionally on Shabbat is prohibited for consumption forever. Now, my ta'amad Rabbi Yochanan Sandlar. Why Rabbi Yochanan Sandlar go to that strong view that one is prohibited to eat something that was made intentionally on Shabbat? Ki dedarish Rabbi Chiya apitcha devei nesi'ah. Here we zoom in something that it's so fascinating that it is our Torah portion. What did Torah tells us? We just in that time. Book of Shmot, Exodus chapter 34, verse 14. Ushmartem et ha-Shabbat, ki kodesh. The Torah said you should observe the Shabbat because it's the holy days, the sacred days for you. Ma kodesh asur be'achila. The same way that some food that belong to the, good morning, to the Hekdesh, if it was consecrated, is prohibited for consumption. Af ma'aseh Shabbat asur ba'achila. If someone did something intentionally on Shabbat, is the same prohibition of consumption as a consecrated item. Ima kodesh asur ba'naf ma'aseh Shabbat asur ba'naf. Talmud lomar lachem shelachem yehe, which means behana'at, to derive a benefit by giving it to a non-Jew, meaning either giving or selling, that's a different story. That's okay. Yachol afilu beshogeg. So based on the analogy between actions that desecrate Shabbat and sacred items, one might have thought that even if the action was performed unwittingly, Yachol afilu beshogeg, it should be prohibited to eat its product. So how you do it? For example, the Shita Mekubetzet explained based on the Rashi that the person just forget that today is Shabbat. So Talmud lomar, you derive from the text, Mechalalei amot yumad b'mezid amarti lecha, ולא בשוגג. That's specifically if it was in a full gear of intent. פליגי בה רב אחא ורבינה. אחד אמר מעשה שבת דאורייתא, ואחד אמר מעשה שבת דרבנן. Here you have a disputation between Rav Acha and Ravina. Rav Acha hold that according to Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar, any manner that in action that desecrates Shabbat is prohibited by Torah law, and therefore it's biblical prohibition of consumption. And the other, meaning Ravina, hold that it's by rabbinic law. So usually that's the Gemara in Pesachim 74b that said that when you have this disputation, the rule is that Rav Acha, he is the one who's more stringent, and Ravina is the lenient, and we follow Ravina. Manda amar d'oraita k'de amaran, as we said, Manda amar d'Rabanan amar kra kodeshu. He kodesh ven maseh kodesh, meaning that biblically speaking, listen carefully, biblically speaking, you can eat it. The sages, which is Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar, came eat and put a boundary and said no, if it was intentional work, is prohibited forever, no matter what. So the Chavot Yair is one of the famous responsa in chapter 142. He challenged Taz, the code on Yoreh De'ah 117. He asked a question: since we have certain ruling Torah that are lenient, is that for real that the rabbis can come in and put such a severe boundary? For example, here Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar that said that it's prohibited after Shabbat. But if you want to go the next step, is a Maharshal. Maharshal brought Rosh and Ran, and the Rashash tried to respond. The question is, you have a case that the person did something on Shabbat in violation, and you are telling me by this view that after Shabbat, even it was made for other people, that food, for example, it cannot be used anymore. So when we juxtapose to our previous discussion, which is the monetary payment of 4 and 5, what's the reason we exempted it? But again, it's above the scope of our discussion in a short time today. Why, if someone used someone else to slaughter that animal on Shabbat, is exempt from the payment of 4 and 5? Ki kapatrei Rabbanan ash'ara. When you have this rabbinic exemption, that apply to what? To other cases we mentioned, which, for example, someone did it for idol worshipping, someone did it for the animal to already have a verdict to be stoned. So here we do not hold, when it's come to Shabbat, the kimle b'deramba minei, because it's made by others. So in that sense, you see that it's yesh shaliach ledvar avera, and you need to pay 4 and 5. Now, the truth is, the Shita Mekubetzet hold here that, again, you have to differentiate between the emissary or the thief himself. But we go further and we say, Toveach la'avodat kochavim. If someone slaughtered for idolatry, is liable to pay the owner for the animal. Meaning, the question is, why Rabbi Meir, Rashba asked, hold the thief to go to that extra payment of 4 and 5, kevan d'shachat beputa itzarle, meaning the moment he starts slaughtering for the purpose of idol worship, so it's already prohibited. As we explained earlier, the Gemara in Tractate Chulin, page 40, explained to us that there is a process of slaughtering, and one is they call kaneh, and one is called veshet. In order to have the slaughter of animal in the proper way that the animal can be eaten, it has to be in that process of recognize those signs, etc. So if person did it for the goal of idol worshipping, then the whole concept of kosher slaughtering is not in order. So they said, idach ki katavach, lav de marei katavach. אמר רבא, ואומר בגמר זביחה הוא עובדה. Guess what? At the beginning he have at least the appearance intent that it is what? For the purpose of kosher slaughtering. At the end, he declared that that's for idol worshipping. So the prohibition against using that meat is only when the slaughtering process was in completion. Up to that point, that animal belonged to its owner, and therefore the thief, if he slaughtered that animal, he needs to pay those 4 1/5 payment. Sure, aniska lav dideu ketavach. So again, we do not have enough time, but is a ktzot achoshen. He elaborates on Gemara in Gittin, page 20. What is the definition of isurei hana? Ma ha'hagdara? Meaning, for example, a person, he took an animal that it's already designated to be stoned, meaning animal that belonged to Reuven, that ox went and killed Shimon. It went before the court session, and the court said you have to put that ox to not to sleep, but stone it in a biblical term. And guess what? A person now wants to, for example, to slaughter that animal and sell it, or for example, to eat that animal, etc. Or someone stole it from him. And now, do you tell me that ox have value or not? Is that ox that originally can be sold in the market, regular market, for $100,000, right, big ox, since it was already verdict in order that ox shall be stoned, so any manner of which that ox used is carry any monetary value or not? If it carries any halachic application, if someone derive any benefit, such as eating, deriving any benefit from that, if you damage that animal, if you carry a blemish or anything, it's not in shve pruta, it's not, is worth 0, and therefore do you require the damagee to pay the owner any money? Or you said the other way around. You said, wait a second, that animal is not slaughtered yet, is not stoned yet, so therefore the owner has some connection to that animal. Now you ask you what the application. One is the Kritin, page 20. So the Ktzot HaChoshen explained to us that if someone writes a get to his wife, and in order to exercise the right of the get, he needs to have a monetary value. And you have here a issue if that animal that already designated for what? For stoning, if the owner of that animal can use that animal as a monetary value to pay the expense of as a bill of divorce, right? So the Gemara over there, the discussion על זית, קרן שור הנסכל, anyway. אמר רבא, הכה במאי עסקינן, כגון שמסרו לשומר, והזיק בבית שומר, ונגמר דיני בבית שומר, וגנבו מבית השומר. So here you have a situation. The owner of the ox, he gave the ox to someone to guard it. And so Reuven gave to Shimon his ox to guard the ox. And then the ox, while he's under the auspices of Shimon, he went ahead and he killed someone on the property of Shimon. And then you bring it before the rabbinic court, and they decided that ox, since he killed a person, he need to be stoned. Now, while this ox is about to be stoned, someone stole it from the house of Shimon. So Rabbi Meir סבר לה כרבי יעקב וסבר לה כרבי Shimon, that the thief needs to pay the 4 1/5, even it doesn't carry any monetary value because that ox is already designated for stoning. So the Gemara explains, סבר לה כרבי יעקב דאמר, אף מי שנגמר דינו, even that ox is no longer can be used for any benefits, החזירו שומר לבעליו מוחזר. The moment he returned to its owner, it's returned. סבר לה כרבי שמעון, ואמר, דבר הגורם לממון כממון. רבי מאיר hold the same as רבי שמעון. He said that the legal status of an object that affects monetary like is like that of money, meaning even if the case that the object is worthless, if its elimination causes monetary loss, because it must be replaced, it's considered to have value. So what you see here, although an ox has no value in of itself, slaughtering the animal prevents the belly from returning it intact to the owner, so requiring him to pay the owner the value of the ox before it was sentenced to be stoned. So as a result, the thief must reimburse the bailey as the ox value for the bailey. So, but basically he needs to pay to whom? The thief? To the shomer, to the guard, and not to the owner. That's what the Rav Shach explained in the Achiezer, chapter 3, and also the Osameach al-Chadneiva, that because the monetary value in any manner is only by the guard and not by the owner. Rabba Amar, Le'olam al-idei atzmo. You have to say that this thief didn't slaughter the animal itself. Rabbi Meir, page 34b. Rabbi Meir lokeh u'meshalem itlei. And by the view of Rabbi Meir, he holds in general only when one can receive malkot and pay the same manner of crime. But if it does hold that one can be put to death and pay for the same time, which means you don't have the idea of kimle b'derabba minei, that you have two penalties and you go by one. V'shane hane, but here he is different. The chidushu shechidsha Torah b'knas, that they hear the Torah carve out with new innovative idea. Rashi tells us in Bava Kama, page 5, that you have a 50 shekel of the one who raped or the one who seduced, and one who gave a defamation of character needs to pay 100 shekel. Af al gav de miktil meshalem. That's the chidush. So even though he is executed, he still need to pay the fine. And the Gemara elaborate and said, ve'azda Rabba letamen. Rabba consists with his reasoning that he has said, Amar Rabba ayagdi ganuv lo utvacho b'Shabbat, if one had the possession a goat stolen, and he slaughtered it on Shabbat, chayav, is liable for the payment, for the fourth fulfillment. שכבר נתחייב בגניבה קודם שיבוא לידי איסור שבת, because he is already become liable for committing theft before he comes to a point of violating the Shabbat prohibition. So therefore, ganav v'tavach b'Shabbat, but if he did it during the Shabbat, that's a different story. Because so if it was before he deserved that death for doing a Shabbat, so then he need to pay 4 and 5. Ganav v'tavach b'Shabbat patur, versus if it happens on Shabbat is exempt. She'im ein gneva, ein tvicha ve'ein mechira. So I explain in my book on Rashi. Rashi said, klomar she'me'achar she'patur al hakeren mishum mita. So Rashi have the issue, why if someone stole on Shabbat, it doesn't have the same rules of stealing. Furthermore, maybe you think that when it's come to a stealing, it's different. But tvicha, the reality is that ox is already slaughtered. So he said, the truth is, the manner of halacha that we judge here, it's if it happens on Shabbat, is different ways. That even he stole, it's still exempt from paying the keren, the original. Why? Because kimle b'derabba, you have 2 penalties. And since he deserved the capital punishment, so he's exempt from the light punishment. So he's exempt from paying the compensation of the tvicha, because they have the 4 and 5 and not 3 and 4. You're welcome to read more in my book. Ve'amar Rabba, similar statement, היה גדי גנוב לו וטבחו במחתרת, חייב שכבר נתחייב מיתה בגניבה, קודם שיבוא לידי איסור מחתרת. גנב וטבח במחתרת, which means he went there and he did it in the tunneling. So they said, so all the matter of stealing was happening in that sense, in tunneling. פטור שאם אין גניבה, אין טביחה ואין מחירה. Because if there is no liability for the theft itself, there is no liability for the slaughter nor for the sale. So you see here two separate entities. One is Shabbat and one is the מחתרת, וצריכה. דיש בינן שבת משום דיסורה איסור עולם. If you talk about Shabbat, as we explained earlier, that the liability of death incurred on the account that is prohibition is everlasting. אבל במחתרת דיסור שעה הוא, that only at the time that he is in that tunneling, so there is prohibited, but it's all temporarily. The moment he is out, you don't impose that. אימה לא, so you don't have קימלה בדרב מנביא, השמיע מחתרת משום למחתרתו זוהי התרתו. אבל בשבת דבעי התרא אימה לא צריכה, so the rabbi need to teach us both, that both ruling, that regardless if he did it in tunneling or Shabbat, he is exempt from that payment because you impose, if you have two penalties, you impose the severe penalty and you exempt from the light one. אמר רבא, similar rules, הייתה פרה גנובה לו. If you had in a possession a cow stolen by him before the Shabbat, and he then slaughtered it on Shabbat, ודבחה בשבת חייב. He needs to pay the fifth payment שכבר נתחייב בגנבה קודם שיבוא לידי איסור שבת, because he's already under the monetary payment for stealing before the Shabbat occurred. So even doing Shabbat he deserved this severe penalty of violation Shabbat, but you do not have the kimle b'derabamina, you don't have the exemption of the light penalty because it wasn't the same time, it was in a consequence different time, it's a different order. הייתה פרה שאולה לו, ודבחה בשבת, פטור. Okay, because the time of the טביחה, the time of the slaughtering, it was the same time that it was stolen. So it means, what you see here, when it's all together, שואל שטובח, a borrower that slaughter, it's mammon, it's monetary. So therefore, he needs to pay. אמר לרבה חברי דרב לרבה אשי רב פאפה פרה עתה לשמואינה. So it's obvious. So אמר לי רב פאפה שאולה עתה לשמואינה. He come to teach us that if someone took a borrowed cow on Shabbat and slaughtered, so he is exempt. סגלתך מן הואיל ואמר רב פאפה. This is a statement in Baba Metzia 91 in regard to someone borrow. Remember we used the car rental example? For those who came late, let me just refresh your memory. So someone rent a car, so you are obligated to treat it properly. So if you don't change the oil, right? So you basically have some liabilities, right? In ancient times, someone borrowed an ox to walk in a field, and you put, how do you call it?
Muzzle.
Muzzle, thank you. You put a muzzle on the ox, so you save money, so the ox cannot eat while you're having the ox walking for you in the field. So he said, how you treat it? So they said, Mish'ad Mishicha Uridit Chevel B'mzenotea. One of the manner of acquisition is when you lift it up or moving it up to your domain. So the moment you pull it out, then you're obligated. Now, here's the idea. The Torah said in Deuteronomy 25, you shall not lo tachsom shor bedi shor. You should not put a muzzle on the ox when they need to eat. So if you basically not treated the animal the way that the owner asked you to do it, so you need to compensate the owner of that animal for the value of the food that the ox will eat during the time of work, in addition to malkot. So they said, so you may juxtapose to here, and you said, from the moment that he borrowed the cow prior to the incurring liability for desecration of the Shabbat, at the time of the slaughter, he become liable to pay the unavoidable mishaps, kamash melan. So therefore, Rav Papa teach us otherwise, which is that since that as long as that cow was in the property of the borrower, he needs to return to it honor. So it's he is not obligated to all of that. So what do you derive from that? You see here, the Ritva explained that as long as the animal is alive, is in the owner's domain. So here you see a huge difference between a thief and a borrower. Ganav, a thief, he is obligated immediately for anything that happened. The moment you stole something, anything, even is beyond your control, the moment you take it, it's in a sense under your auspicism. You are responsible for anything, including things that is above on a sim. Versus a borrower, you have to have a special reason because you are in a domain of borrowing it, and therefore if it's beyond your control, you can exercise the kimle b'derava minei, that you put the severe penalty and you exempting from the light penalty.
Boyachem leshuloim malachai yeshuloim malachai